All right, folks. Like I said, I committed to do this for 365 days. So we're just going to get in. We're going to get started now. Last time I talked a little bit about how I wound up getting some of my heroes on the podcast. I started out with Greg Pollock, but the problem that I had was I was a total noob. Remember, I had been doing Ruby on Rails in a semi-professional capacity. I really hadn't nailed down exactly, any expertise whatsoever other than that. And I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anybody in the community at all. I had gone to a local Ruby conference, but a lot of the speakers, flew in, gave their talks, flew out, right? And it was kind of this weird place that I was in when I decided to start the show, because I didn't have any way of getting any of these people on the show. And so I wanted to, right? I wanted to talk to these folks and just learn from them, right? That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to level up to the point where I could go get that job. And so I reached out to a few people, and amazingly, people just told me yes. Initially anyway. So I got Greg just because I had asked him. We had been in communication, so he just came on the show. I wound up emailing a speaker from one of the conferences that I attended. His name was James, and he'll probably come into some of my other adventures later on because we wound up starting a podcast together. But yeah, so we had James, and James was fairly well known in the community. I think he had written a book or two by then about Ruby on Rails, or Ruby or Rails. I mean, he ran a weekly Ruby challenge. I'm trying to think. He had done a bunch of other things. He was pretty well known too for kind of having this encyclopedic knowledge of Ruby. And so by bringing him in to speak about the programming language and where this all came in, that was pretty exciting, right? So I just reached out to him. I also went and just looked up people who were working on Ruby on Rails. In other words, the people who were building the framework that I was building websites with. And I got a Rails core team member. For if you're not familiar with the jargon, essentially, he's one of the people that can commit whatever he wants to the framework and it'll go in. Now, I'm sure that, they clean stuff out, as the process goes. But anyway, the thing that I really wanted to talk about, though, with this is that ultimately my goal was to get David Heinemeier Hansen on my little podcast, right? So Rails Coach was the name of the podcast. I wound up renaming it to the Teach Me to Code podcast. And I'll put, in fact, I can just put it in right now. So I'll just put a link in to those first episodes so you can kind of go see what I did. But yeah, I wanted to talk to David. Now, some of you might be somewhat familiar with David. He works at Basecamp. If you're not familiar with Basecamp, he was the original developer at Basecamp. Now he works on it and kind of runs the team there. Wound up pulling Ruby on Rails as a system out of Basecamp and making it so that other people could build sites like Basecamp. So anyway, and if you've read any of the books, I think Jason Fried is better known in the business community for what he's done, but a lot of those books are co-authored by David. So he was like the holy grail, right? If I could get David on my show. And so I emailed him, right? Because it worked for everybody else, right? It worked for James. It worked for Pratik, who had on, worked for Greg. So of course I emailed David, and I don't think he even emailed me back. And if he did, he probably said no. I don't remember the details, but I remember specifically it didn't work, right? I sent him an email and nothing happened, right? So I keep going, right? Because I'm just pig-headed that way. And yeah, so I get some other people on. I keep talking about what I'm learning. If you go back and look, weeks that I didn't have a guest, I would just talk about whatever I was doing, right? So, I keep going. I wind up interviewing Chad Fowler, who was really well known in the Ruby community at that time. That's episodes 13 and 14, right? So I'm getting these people. I wrote the guy that wrote the book about the Ruby programming language. He also had written another book that I read, got a couple of other authors on. This podcast thing's working out. I'm getting a few hundred downloads every week. I got another podcaster or two on. Anyway, it's just, it was just interesting, right? So I'm getting all these people that are well known, but David is out of reach, right? He's the one that I wanted. He's the one that I wanted to talk to. In the Rails community, we call him DHH, David Heinemeier Hansen, because it's easier to say. So anyway, so I'm I think I probably emailed him again. I followed him on Twitter, tried to reach him that way. It didn't work, right? And so a lot of these people too, I wound up getting a hold of either by going to conferences, and that's the thing, right? Is if we're talking about how to get some of these heavy hitter that was ridiculous. All right, how to get these heavy hitters like Dave Thomas, right? I met him at a conference, and then I got his contact details, and we set up the interview, right? And so I just did the interview, and I used some software that worked over Skype. I don't know if I highly recommend that software anymore, and Skype isn't the best place to record, but anyway, super interesting. Kevin Rutherford, I read his book and then emailed him, and that's also a good way to get in with people is, hey, I read your book, or I watched your video, or I whatever. People like to hear that, and so he was trying to promote the book, and that made that easier. But David was just out of reach. I mean, there was just no way. And anyway, so what finally wound up happening, and I have to admit it took a little bit of courage because I almost didn't do it. I was at RailsConf, and RailsConf is the big conference about Ruby on Rails. So I was at RailsConf, and David had given the keynote speech the day before. And I went up and I talked to him for a minute, but I chickened out and I didn't ask him to come on the show. But I was walking through the crowd to take my seat. So I was just walking down one of the aisles, and he was sitting there talking to somebody, and the seat right next to him was open. And so I just sat down and introduced myself and told him who I was and why I was excited. And granted, I'd been programming in Rails for 3 years. And then I mentioned, I have a podcast and I'd love to have you on as a guest. And guess what? He said yes. So we worked it out. He was episode 50. He was the 50th podcast episode. I got my big hero, I landed that whale, and I was so excited. I mean, it was just, I can't even tell you, right? I mean, it was just, I don't know. I mean, just super exciting. So, I mean, a lot of this, I guess there are two things that I want to put in here. One is that one of the best ways to get people on is just to ask. Another way to get people on is to get people on who know them. And I had worked on that a little bit. But yeah, the last thing that you can do is, I mean, just walk up to them and ask. But it also gave me a lot more confidence and courage, right? I wound up moving from that to feeling like, okay, if people like David are willing to come on my podcast, and granted, he had no idea who I was before. I email him now and ask him to come on, and a lot of times he'll tell me yes, but that's because we have a rapport over years. But yeah, a lot of it just came down to just having the confidence to go sit down, talk to him, get to know him a little bit, and then ask him to come on the show. And so what I recommend to you is that you go through all that process and maybe demonstrate a little more confidence than you actually have, because you can do that in some non-conventional ways. But yeah, so that's kind of the lesson today is essentially, if you want to get the heavy hitters, go ask. And if you can't get them to come on that way, then go find out who it is. Because if you go back through somebody's backlog, a lot of times you'll see somebody else in there that was the person that connected the podcaster to that higher level or bigger, heavier, hittier person. And you can get that lined up. And so that's what I recommend. So if you're trying to get that person. That's what I would do. Another thing that I found that works, that gets past a lot of people, is if I spend a few minutes looking at their LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And then what I do, and I do this for sponsors too, actually, is I'll send them a bombbomb.com video. And there are other systems that do the same thing, but essentially you record a video like this and you just introduce yourself and talk for a minute. A lot of people are much more willing to open those because it says video email from so-and-so. And then they can play it. And then a lot of times they'll respond to me that way. But yeah, I'm just throwing out tips now. But the ultimate message here is show some confidence. Find ways to just get in front of them. I mean, don't get in their face, but just get in front of them, and then, do the work, get to know them a little bit, and do something a little bit unconventional, like sitting next to them and swallowing a little bit of that fear and just going for it. All right, there you go. That's my 2 bits here today. And I'll have another one tomorrow.